Does Luke chapter 16 ring a bell? How about the parable of the rich man and Lazarus? Now I'm going to close out with 3 passages Bengali uses in his video. Probably 2 of the most misunderstood, the most misinterpreted, and the most misapplied passages. The first being Luke 16. How many sermons have I heard regurgitated from pulpits proving life after death by the story of the rich man and Lazarus? With a few observations, it will be easy to see that Jesus was not and is not teaching life after death. This parable was never meant to be taken as literal. Let's read this passage. Luke 16, starting in verse 19. There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. But there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So it was that the beggar died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. Then he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received good things, and Lazarus evil things, but now he is comforted, and you are tormented. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, so that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us. Then he said, I beg you therefore, Father, that you would send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. Now I ask you, those of you who take this parable literal, as a literal event, when these 2 individuals died, what went to heaven and hell? Their souls? Their spirits? Both? Their bodies went to this so-called heaven and hell. There are too many physical features in this parable to suggest a soul or spirit is residing in their place of eternal destiny. Let's look at them. The Bible talks in verse 23 of the rich man's eyes. Verse 24, Lazarus' finger. And again in verse 24, the rich man's tongue. Where does the Bible say that this disembodied soul and spirit have physical features? Even Jesus said that a spirit does not have flesh and bones as he did after his resurrection. Another thing, where is the word heaven in this parable? What is this great gulf fixed between Abraham's bosom and hell? Where can I find this gulf elsewhere in the Bible? How big must Abraham's bosom be to hold all the saints that went to this place? But you say that all of these are symbols, and I say exactly. You make a serious mistake in biblical interpretation when you start literalizing a parable, especially a parable that is loaded with symbolism and unreal events as this one. There are other serious issues when this parable is taken literally, and I will expound on a great deal more in the presentation on hell coming in the future. And everybody's favorite going to heaven text, and Bengali's last 2 proof texts. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan earnestly, desiring to be clothed. We shall not be clothed, we shall not be found naked. We are confident, yes, well pleased rather, to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. And he is quoting 2 Corinthians 5, verses 1, 2, and 8. Just as all other attempts by pastors and priests and teachers with this passage, the context is chopped up and fragmented at best, and a misinterpretation usually follows a distorted context, and Bengali does not disappoint, as his following statement clearly reveals. I'm going to read this how he meant for it to be read, not how it is written. And this is his commentary on the passage we just read. To be absent from the body, our soul, is to be present with the Lord. What was absent from the body? The soul. What was then and there present with God? The soul. Now, I have read these verses many times, and Bengali sees phrases and words in that passage that I have never seen, heard, or read. So I reread them from the Bible. The word soul, Greek word psuche, never appears in those verses, and yet Bengali sees them there, and he puts them there by his own interpretation and imagination. What was then and there present with God? The soul, in quotation marks, as if he is quoting it from the passage. The phrase, then and there present with God, is not found in the text either. He reads that into the passage, for it is nowhere to be found. Now, let's look at the entire passage, not just fragments, and understand the metaphors to know exactly to what Paul is referring. I'm going to read this passage from the Bible, and then we will break it down because Paul is stating a lot more than what your pastors and preachers have been telling you. And we're going to read 2 Corinthians 5. We're going to start in verse 1, and we're going to go to verse 8. And let's look at from the slides, allowing the context to stay intact. Verse 1. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Here we have Paul using the metaphor or symbols of a house or tent to describe our existence. He also gives us the outline for the next several verses: being alive, our death, and being alive again. Look at it again, it's right there. We live in our earthly house or tent, we're alive. Destroyed is death, a building or house from God not made with hands, alive again. Alive, death, alive again. Listen, this is the context of the next several verses. Verse 2 and 3. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed with our habitation which is from heaven. If indeed having been clothed, we shall not be found naked. Now for clarification purposes, Paul is now reiterating verses 2 and 3, what he just told us in verse 1. And he's using the metaphor or symbols of being clothed and being naked. Nakedness is a metaphor for death and is used elsewhere in the Bible. Job 1:21 and Ecclesiastes 5:15. We are clothed, alive, naked, dead, and being clothed again, alive again. This is too easy not to understand. Paul's imploring us to see the context of this passage. Verse 4, for we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, not because we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, that mortality may be swallowed up by life. Living in our present condition, being alive in this tent, we groan in this tent, being burdened by the strains, the worries, the problems of life. Now notice the next part. Not because we want to be unclothed, and he's referring to being dead. He goes on to explain that we do want to be further clothed, which is the putting on of immortality. And we already have discovered that Paul tells us that we only put on immortality at our resurrection or translation. Look, Paul says that we do not want to be unclothed, to die, because death is the enemy. How can people talk of dying and going on to be with the Lord when it takes the enemy to deliver them there? Paul is going to tell us not to desire death, the enemy, in one passage, and turn around and tell us that it is this enemy that is going to deliver us to Jesus. We have turned this enemy into the red carpet to heaven. We have made Paul a double talker. Verse 5. Now he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who also has given the Spirit as a guarantee. God is the one who's preparing us for this change of mortality, and he has given us the Holy Ghost to guarantee this. 6 and 7. So we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. Now that Paul has established the context, we are getting into the crux or the meat of the passage. Notice here, Paul leaves the metaphorical teaching and starts talking straightforward to us. While we live in this body, while we live in this tent, while we are clothed with this mortality, as the previous verses have mentioned, we are absent from the Lord.